Okay, so thank you everybody for joining today. Welcome. It's the first webinar within the Rural Action Climate Resilience Project for the year. For those of you who don't know, I'll just turn on my camera in case you haven't met me before, but I think most of you have. My name is Tara. I am working with SCAT on the Rural Action for Climate Resilience project, along with colleagues Claire and Indy and Kaya and others who you may have met. And the RACR project is a partnership project. We work mostly with community-based organizations and faith leaders in the Eastern Cape, Western Cape, Northern Cape, Limpopo, Free State, and some of these organizations and groups we've worked with since 2021. And the focus is on building resilience to climate change in rural parts of South Africa. Many of you are within this project, so this is not news to you. But for those of you who are not, this is just to update you and keep you informed about the context of this webinar. And yeah, welcome everybody. Today, we are really, really lucky to have three different speakers focusing from different perspectives on Indigenous adaptation approaches to climate change. And so we have, in alphabetical order, we have Claire Rousell, Shadreck Muchaku, and Sinegugu Zukulu. And just to give you a little bit of background on our speakers today, Claire is an artist, a writer, and a researcher, and has focused a lot of their work on the intersection of food sovereignty, environmental justice, and art. And her work takes a variety of different forms, including visual harvesting, illustration, interactive events, craft, and academic research. Shadreck Muchaku holds a PhD in rural development from the University of Venda, South Africa. His research at the University of Fort Hare covers a number of different topics, including community engagement, water, sanitation and hygiene, climate smart agriculture, and he's interested in particular in the relevance of Indigenous knowledge systems, governance in dual systems, water sanitation, climate change, regional health governance, local health priorities, and conflict resolution. And last but not least, Sinegugu Zukulu is the director of Sustaining the Wild Coast, and many of you might know him for his activism within the Amadiba area to stop the destructive seismic testing for oil and gas off the South Africa's wild coast. And last year, he and his fellow activist Nonhle Mbuthuma won the Goldman Prize Award, and he is an Indigenous knowledge expert and enthusiast with a wealth of knowledge that we are very privileged to have today with us. So really, really privileged to have very different perspectives coming into this webinar. And yeah, really excited to have all of you here. Thank you so much for taking the time. Without further ado, I think I'm going to hand over. So our order of events today, we're going to first have each of the speakers present for 15 minutes each, and then we're going to have half an hour for a Q&A and audience discussion. So please keep a note of your questions. Also, if you have questions during presentations, you can write them in the chat. We'll pay attention to those and bring those up later during the discussion session. So the order of the speakers is going to be Sinegugu first, then Claire, and then Dr. Muchaku. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to Sinegugu. Let me know if you're able to start sharing. Okay, perfect. Great. That's all from me then for now.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Tara. And good morning, everyone. Okay. Yeah, I am going to be talking to you. I think it is important. I come from a rural landscape, and it is important to know that most rural farmers, they are not even aware of some of the things which are associated with climate change. In other words, they see things happening, but not necessarily aware. So it's another area that still has a lot of work to be done in terms of making them aware. But also some of these rural areas are isolated. As a result, people are not even having the opportunity of researchers coming in there. But without much ado, let's delve into my presentation. So I would like to take you through some of the lessons from Bondoland. I'm trying to get my presentation there to move to the next slide. Okay, so one thing that in our area, one of the things that people do is to have these permanent homestead gardens. And usually you can see the diversity, and most of those, especially in the area of Kolobeni, they are located within on the edges of wetlands or within the wetlands. One of the challenges that farmers have is that with the climate change or with increase in temperatures, with the warming planet, is that the behavior of certain animals, mammals, insects, and all that, they are changing. You have got the emerging ones, you have got new challenges and all that, which are coming up due to the warming planet. So just going to be sharing with you some of the things. For instance, the plant I'm showing you, which is the wild yam, we call it ingcolo locally, is used to chase away the blind mole. So what you do, where you have planted your rooty crops, be it amadumbe, the tarium, or sweet potatoes, or potatoes, where you have your rooty crops. So you plant this particular plant amongst your plants. So if a blind mole comes across this plant, it bites this plant, it will then move as far away as possible. So blind moles, it doesn't kill it, but it is very good at repelling it and chasing it away. There are other uses, of course, for the wild yam. Ingcolo is collected from the indigenous forest. And then people bring it home and then they would grow it then. But the issue of blind mole, we are seeing with time, that one is a traditional usage, the use of the wild yam ingcolo. But there are new challenges or there are new innovations that farmers are bringing up. For instance, right now we are seeing an emergence of, this is a sweet potato field, and people are using these, they are making use of these 2-liter bottles. They stick them on sticks like that. So when there's a bit of wind, and then that 2-liter bottle is going to make a noise, and then the noise is transferred underground. Blind moles, because they are blind, they tend to be very sensitive to noise, and they are able to. So you can see they stick those all over the place. So instead of having a lot of wild yams, so instead you stick. That's something which has emerged in the past 10 years or so, where the farmers are using to chase away the blind mole, because your harvest lies underground. If the blind mole comes, they love sweet potato, then you will harvest nothing. So in order to make sure they don't come, therefore you create that noise for them. So the other challenge is this particular plant, which is known as Tricha asiatica, which is the red witchweed. We call it ihlube locally. If where you have your crop field in Tsimi, where you grow your crops, there is this particular plant. This is very dangerous. You have to manage. So the best way is it grows attached to the roots of the host plant, and the weed robs its host of water and nutrients. So you harvest nothing in that field. So what you do, the farmers, they know. I'm talking about the farmers who have not been taught this by extension officers, the indigenous knowledge. They know that you need to plant your field during the first 2 weeks of September. Between 1 and 15 of September, you must plant, so that by the time, because this weed comes up in November, by the time it comes up, your millet crop must be ready, so that it doesn't affect it. Often there is always a talk about that field has got ihlube, so therefore you need to either plant it very early or very late, around, let's say, December, January, so that this particular weed would not be a problem. So the other coping strategies, I mentioned the growing of crops in these wetlands. So what has happened is that over the years, the farmers have ended up bringing tools and implements which they use, which span of oxen drawn. We call it is skofolo. I really don't know the English word, but you use it to remove weeds in between your crops. As a result, if you have your pumpkins in between, then you have a challenge of that process of removing weeds using, this is a 3 or 4 or 5 legged little hose which you use to clear the weeds in between the lines. So because of that, with the people are now using these modern means and ways. So what happens is that your pumpkin and your calabash crops, they get destroyed. So as a result, the farmers have therefore started planting these pumpkin and calabash plants on the edge, alongside, outside the field, in order to make sure that they are able to, they still enjoy pumpkins and calabashes, and they can use the latest implements. So which is another adaptation as a strategy of making sure that they are able. So you will often find as you walk through that all those pumpkins and calabashes are on the edge of the field. The other challenge which we have seen, which is directly related to climate change recently, if you remember the floods which killed nearly 500 people in Durban. So the farmers in our area, those rains were not only confined to KZN or to Durban, but they came all the way to the northern Eastern Cape. So our area was affected. We lost all the bridges, so people couldn't go to town, they couldn't get to clinics. But in terms of farmers, what happened was that the fields, in particular where people are growing sweet potatoes and yams, they were affected. So farmers had to come up with adaptation strategies, because if your sweet potato sits in a waterlogged soil for 3 to 5 days, you must forget it. All that sweet potato will be rotten. You can actually, if you walk there after a week, you will smell a rotten sweet potato. So what have farmers, since they started doing, is to dig all these furrows around the fields so that they could manage the amount of water, in particular the surface flow that enters their crop fields. So as you can see here in the furrow, there's lots of water. So the only water that will get to their field is the rain which is falling onto their field. Otherwise, all the excess surface flow gets directed around in order to protect there's a sweet potato crop inside the field. So that one, again, is a new adaptation strategy which farmers have to use, because for your sweet potatoes and yams are winter harvest crops. So their season is between March and September, and those are the drier months. And therefore, you need a soil which is dry. Otherwise, once the soil is waterlogged, then they're going to be rotting. So in order to make sure that those crops, they stay on dry land, so they have had to come up with these strategies. The other thing, of course, that is important to farmers in order to adapt to climate change is to diversify their food sources and to make sure that they are not relying. You see there's mealies, sweet potatoes, there's yams, there's beans, there's pumpkins, there's calabashes. So there's the whole lot. So making sure that you have got a food diversity in order to make sure that even if one is one crop could not survive due to excess rain or due to drought, but then you have the other crops. For instance, amongst the other things is how do you diversify your orchard, all those big trees you see there, the avocado pears, trees, the bananas, the mangoes, your lemons, your oranges. So making sure that even within your orchard, you have a good diversity of food sources, because the way those react to either drought or to extreme rain events differ. So that's the other thing that farmers are doing. The traditional way of planting seeds in Pondoland has been the scattering of seeds, where like the man you see on the right-hand side here is scattering the seeds. And then after scattering, then the cattle, they plow up the area. And then you start removing the weeds before even your crops germinate. That's the traditional way. And in some areas, fortunately, they still practice that, especially, and those people, they don't have to use any means to fertilize because they have very fertile soil, in particular the areas closer to the north of Port St. John's, in those forested areas. That's how now people still plant. Though in other areas, people have started using crop manure, started using even chemical fertilizers, unfortunately, but there are means, and the people who have been able to protect their soil by relying on those traditional ways, they are doing very well. So the other thing is the use of wetlands. Farmers tend to, the way that the wetlands are used is not draining wetlands, but you dig furrows in order to make sure that your yams, your madumbes, or your crops, they are staying on a drier land. But you keep those furrows within so that the water stays within that particular area. And then also the other trick is to rest that wetland the following year. So you can come back maybe after 3 or 4 years to come back. So as Senpi has just recently done a study to look at the quality of our wetlands, and they were amazed given how much they are being used, but to find how amazing. But also staying into those areas means during the times and the years of drought, the farmers are still able to have good food, because at the bottom of those valleys in the wetland areas, they have permanently moist soils. So as a result, farmers, they are able to harvest even during the times of drought. The other thing which is done, which is in Bonoland, is to scatter your crops. You don't plant your mealies once. You start planting an early crop as early as August, another one in September, October, November, December, and the very last one will be beginning of January, making sure that even if one harvest is affected, but then the other one won't be affected. So keeping that water within that particular, this is at Kwanyana, and the buildings you see there with one Ronavis, and that's a Kwanyana Lodge, which is a community-owned lodge still under construction, which will also serve food developed from here. So that's just to show you how these wetlands are used and how people make sure that the wetland that does not lose its wet. And then as I move towards the end of my presentation, I'd like to tell you how one of the things we've seen is the increase in the amount of bush pigs in Bonderland. So people, because with the new act, the South African Schools Act, kids have got to go to school. Traditionally, kids had to take turns, some of them to herd animals, some of them to wait for monkeys, Ulinda. You wait for monkeys, especially in the forested areas, in the fields which are closer to the forest. So, but what have people done as an adaptation strategy? They have now trained dogs to wait for the monkeys. The little basin you see there with water, that's the water for the dog that sits here. What happens is that they only feed the dog here in the field, and the bucket of the dog's food will be hanging up on a tree in this field. So the dog, and you open a small hole so that there are some drops of maybe gravy that keep falling. The dog sits there looking after its food, and you don't feed your dog at home, only here. So it stays here. Whenever the dog hears the noise being made by the monkeys in the forest, then it will start barking, running along the field all the way, barking at the monkeys, so monkeys do not come to your field. The problem, another challenge is the problem of the bush pigs. So what happens is that in this little shelter you see, they make fires so that they smoke all night long. And if there is fire, they smoke, and you're putting in all the sails in order to make sure even if it's raining, the rain doesn't extinguish the fire. So if there is smoke, the bush pigs, they don't dare come nearby there. The cane rats, what they do is to flatten the tall grass on the edges of the mealie field. When you flatten or you cut off the grass, the cane rats, they don't, because they like to hide underneath the tall grass, hiding away from the hawks and the eagles, the birds of prey. So those are all, and these are amazing strategies because they are able to protect the wildlife. They are not about killing, eliminating, but it's about how do you actually coexist with the wildlife in those forested regions. So if you will see again when you travel around Bonderland is that most homesteads, they have an aloe growing, and that aloe is administered to poultry in their water. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sinegugu. That was perfectly on time. And so many really valuable pieces of insight and information that you shared. I think the chat is there are people in the chat asking for insights and some questions, but hopefully there'll also be more later. I think there was just one question that maybe we can address now, which was, do you know what the isiXhosa term is for yam?
There are two yams I've spoken about today. There's amadumbe, which is the taro yam, which is the edible one, and then the wild yam, ingolo, which is the one that we use to chase away the blind mole. So taro yams, we call them amadumbe. Some people call them madumbes. If you go to Pick n Pay and Spar, they call them madumbes. Otherwise, they are amadumbe. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm sure there'll be more questions in the chat later on, but we'll get to that when we have the Q&A and audience discussion towards the end. So now we're going to hand over to Claire If you want to start sharing. And just so that you don't get interrupted, I'll turn on my camera so you have a 5-minute mark for time, so you don't get distracted by my voice.
Thanks, Tara. Hi, everyone. It's really such an honor to be here. And what I'm going to talk about today has come out of research that I've been doing with SAFC over the last 6 months, particularly around Indigenous food and climate change. But I've been learning about and with Indigenous foods, seeds, and medicinal plants probably for the last 6 years. But I'm really a child in this work, and I sit at the feet of people like Untitled Zukulu and Dr. Muchaku. So I hope that what I share today will be of use. Let me just make the screen a little more user-friendly. Okay. So I also, just to locate where I'm coming from, so I come to this work as a result of the unsettledness that comes with being a child of the colony. And these plants have offered many ways, many pathways into deeper relationship and healing these divisions. And one of the ways that I first started engaging with Indigenous food plants was through the lens of resilience. And in particular, in the face of increasingly unstable climate futures. And resilience, of course, is not only an individual pursuit and cannot be. Resilience at its core is a collective project. And that collective is made up of human communities, but also of plants, animals, insects, birds, and all other kinds of living beings. So I'm hoping that, let me just make sure that this, there we go. So community resilience. So what is that? The capacity of a community to adapt, survive, thrive in the face of change, uncertainty, and stresses. And when communities are able to do these things well, they're more resilient to climate change. And I'm sure these are things that you're all very familiar with over your long work around resilience and community. And so, again, I'm sure you're very familiar with these thoughts, that these are some of the ways that community resilience can look. So it's about building alternatives, it's about disaster preparedness, it's about resistance to extractive projects and industries, and about restoring ecosystems, catchment areas, rivers, soils, etc. And over this piece of research and over these years, what has become very clear is that Indigenous food systems kind of are at the heart of all of the all aspects of community resilience. So Indigenous food systems are linked to reviving local cultures, strengthening intergenerational relationships, supporting efforts towards food sovereignty, restoring connection to land and all of creation, supporting spiritual and cultural healing, and encouraging collaboration. And all of these things make communities so much stronger, as I'm sure that you all are aware from your ongoing work. So, Indigenous food systems and food sovereignty. So as Ntate Zukulu has shared with us, we can see that one of the aspects of Indigenous foods and Indigenous food systems is that they are far more resilient in unpredictable climate conditions. Many are very resilient to floods, droughts, and by growing Indigenous foods within diverse systems, there's a greater chance of harvesting something rather than harvesting nothing, which may be the case if one is planting a monoculture of maize, for example, and then it's hit by a climate event that it cannot adapt to. But if you've got some maize, you've got some sorghum, you've got morojo, you've got sweet potatoes, you've got madumbe, and then like Ntate Zukulu said, you will have something. And There are also, of course, many traditional methods of preserving indigenous foods, which also contribute to the preparedness for shocks, so drying foods, or preserving them, fermenting them, and keeping them in all sorts of forms that mean that there's some kind of food store that can be drawn upon if in the case of climate change events. And all of this makes people more sovereign, have more agency, and less reliant on industrial food systems. So, and the less that we rely on industrial food systems, the more independent, autonomous communities are able to be in increasingly unpredictable situations. Indigenous food systems also have the quality of strengthening intergenerational relationships. So, of course, so much of the knowledge of indigenous foods is held by elders who remember older ways of doing things, and also perhaps even remember what their parents and grandparents did. And largely this knowledge is held by women, not exclusively, but there's definitely a leaning towards that. And young people, on the other hand, are staring climate change in the face in a far more extreme way than perhaps older generations who may not live to see some of the worst effects. And so recognizing the importance of indigenous food systems and indigenous knowledge systems, as young people may be doing, looking at what is to come, this has the potential to strengthen relationships with elders who have these older knowledges that can be drawn upon for increased adaptation and resilience. Young people might also, as in the case of Amadiba, where Untitled Zukulu is from, have fantastic innovative ideas for recipes and festivals and ways to celebrate and promote indigenous foods that older people may have only the traditional ways of preparing them. And so there's a lot of potential there for strengthening those relationships that may, in many cases, have been severed by modernization, by people moving to cities, and kind of schisms developing across generations. Similarly, indigenous foods encourage collaboration. A lot of them require whole communities to do the planting, the harvesting, the preservation techniques, and some of these practices you may be familiar with under the name of Ilima or Letsema, and which would often involve a kind of work party and then eating together and drinking together afterwards. And these kinds of things can really build community cohesion, and that cohesion can make communities so much stronger. And again, this can contribute to intergenerational collaboration, because young people bringing their strength and their enthusiasm, older people bringing the knowledge and the techniques, and this can really strengthen these relationships. Indigenous food systems contribute to reviving local knowledge and restoring connection to land and creation. So for indigenous food systems to thrive, they really rely on holistic knowledge of local ecosystems. And so building up that knowledge as a community can not only strengthen food sovereignty, food security, but it can also contribute to a broader project based on indigenous knowledge. So it can help to develop locally relevant climate resilience projects, develop policies based on indigenous knowledge, and can also be part of leading ecosystem restoration rather than having others come in and dictate what that ecosystem restoration should look like. A strong grounding in indigenous knowledge can make communities more able to make decisions about their own environments and ecosystems, and really be the advisors on the decisions around that. And restoring Indigenous food systems contributes to spiritual and cultural healing. And this can't overstate enough how important this is. So this one of the faith leaders from Limpopo, who's part of SAFC's Fleet project, said in one of the meetings, Indigenous food and seeds are deeply intertwined with spiritual practices, representing connection, reciprocity, nourishment, ceremony, creation, prayer, and gratitude. Many indigenous seeds and plants and plant materials have really important roles to play in ceremonies and as offerings in a wide range of different cultures and religious systems. They are deeply connected to sacred natural sites across Southern Africa. So, for example, particular sacred trees that are both food and also a place of ritual and sacred reverence, and a revival, a return, a remembering of these indigenous food systems, the foods involved in them, and the customs involved can be integral in strengthening pride in individual and collective identity, where this may have been damaged by trauma and injustice due to colonialism, apartheid, and ongoing poverty and inequality. There's a really amazing piece of research that Makadzi Bompateleni Makulule and Gareth Barnwell and others put together in 2021, where they looked at the detrimental effects of the loss of sacred natural sites. So here, for the most part of this talk, I've spoken about the benefits of reconnecting with indigenous food systems, but the other side is that loss, and that loss of indigenous food systems, that loss of cultural knowledge, and the loss of connection to sacred natural sites can really be a very harmful to communities and individuals. Their well-being can lead to despair, hopelessness, anger, resentment, and many other aspects that really affect people's well-being. And they've written this very powerful piece on that. And so to bring this back to how I started, so these are all ways that communities can be strengthened and are strengthened by indigenous food systems. But the relationship between the individual and the community is so integral. So what can so easily happen is that when communities are stronger, when they are more resilient, the individuals within them also stand a better chance of having good health, immunity, and being more physically adaptable. Those individuals may feel more supported and connected to others, more connected to land and cultural and spiritual roots. This can increase confidence and agency and ultimately a sense of purpose. And so these things really feed back into each other. So, so stronger individual resilience feeds back again into community resilience, and then stronger community resilience feeds back into individual resilience. And indigenous food systems are really at the heart of that, and really, are having profound effects and can have even more profound effects if we give them more attention and honor their power. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Claire. And yeah, thank you for sharing really valuable insights from your own personal expertise on this subject and research, over a much longer period than just the past 6 months as well. I think, again, there are some questions that have come up in the chat, but we're going to I think maybe address those at the end, just so that we can keep to time. Yeah, again, audience members, participants, please feel free to keep populating the chat with questions. We are keeping track of them. Okay, so without further ado, let's hand over to Shadreck, to Dr. Muchaku. Let me know if you're able to start sharing. Great. Again, I'll turn on my camera at the 5-minute mark, just so that you are aware that your time is running out.
Oh, okay. Good morning, everyone. It's now, good morning. Still in the morning. Thank you for the opportunity to present. So I think much has been said already. So I'm just going to perhaps be skipping most of the slides since they have been covered already. But this study is based on a study that we conducted here in Eastern Cape on adapting to uncertainty in indigenous strategies for water conservation in changing climates. So just maybe to give background, I thought maybe we could as well just have a definition for indigenous knowledge. So many definitions, but for the purpose of this discussion, perhaps I thought is the context-specific knowledge that communities have developed themselves for centuries and allowed them to live in the environment for long periods of time. But then, why are we talking about indigenous knowledge? The reason is there have been several strategies, several approaches that have been suggested in trying to adapt to climate change. I'm also happy that there is rural action for climate resilience. Then that speaks of actually advocates for solutions, rural solutions for rural problems. So the need for indigenous knowledge has gained momentum in recent studies because of its potential to enhance the translation of actionable climate change strategies that must be informed by the knowledge and wisdoms of those whose lives would continue to be adversely affected by the impacts of climate change. So perhaps on this study, on this slide, I just wanted us to have also an overview of global climate change, which is a long-term global warming of the planet, primarily that is caused by increasing levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And these changes instinctively affects precipitation patterns, leading to droughts in some cases and also floods in some cases. And all these changes, they affect development, and it can be through energy production. There are some countries that rely on water to produce energy, to produce electricity. They are affected when there are droughts. And also the industry itself, farming, is also affected, and food security is affected. So, but we have also spoken about why indigenous strategies in sustainable water management. So, indigenous strategies, they are often preferred because they align with the principles of environmental sustainability. But there are challenges that we have to acknowledge in trying to implement indigenous strategies in water conservation. There is impact of modern agricultural practices, and urbanization. People now have no interest or sometimes patience with the benefits of indigenous strategies. And also the economic and social benefits of using indigenous approaches compared to modern agriculture. Sometimes you would find that the benefits are lesser than those associated with the modern agriculture practices in the short run. So people tend to prefer the modern agricultural practices over these traditional approaches to water conservation and in adapting to climate change. But we are saying local solutions for global challenges. We all accept the reality that climate change is a global issue, but global guidelines sometimes have not been working for our local communities. And this is why indigenous knowledge has become so relevant. So the issue is now, let's think globally and act locally in promoting. So the rural action now comes into play to say our actions must be locally be informed. Our guidelines must be context specific. So I just tried to look at some of the indigenous water conservation practices in this study area. This study was, like I said, conducted in Eastern Cape. So part of the strategies that they are using is rainwater harvesting. As you can see, it's myself there on in the picture to your far left, with a technology that appears a blend of traditional and then modern. This person, he has no adequate resources, but is using the local resources available to harvest water. The other approaches that are being used are traditional irrigation methods and also use of natural vegetation to retain soil moisture, such as mulching, to make sure that water is retained in the soil. So there are also other approaches here. That I wanted us to discuss, like, for example, the Zai pits you see there on with that looks like basins. It's a practice that is commonly used to help in dry areas, to help retain moisture, and also to make sure that water is not lost during the rains. So water is collected in the basin and stored so that it can be the use can be maximized. So this practice as well goes in hand with mulching as well to support water conservation. There are also other approaches that are used that we may also discuss. For example, the traditional approaches in which people, then it's the traditional approaches in which, for example, people consider certain water sources sacred, so that people do not go there to contaminate or pollute water in those areas. So this is also an approach that has been traditionally used to make sure that areas with water for drinking, water for farming is not contaminated and it's not rather polluted. Other approaches as well in water conservation includes also studying animal behaviors. You would find that there are certain behaviors for animals that are characterized with droughts. There are also other behaviors, for example, ants, when they are seen in some cultures, certain type of ants, they are then identified and characterized with a certain season, say, also rains or something like that. So these traditional approaches have been used for a very long, like for generations and generations, and communities have been using different methods to disseminate messages from generation to generation through songs, poems, dramas, etc., etc. So, but I also just wanted us to perhaps take it from an angle that these methods we are trying to promote, we argue that these approaches are not to invalidate modern science, but these approaches can be very effective as they are environmental friendly, and they can also be adapted. Certain elements can be adapted to make sure that they are effective. So I actually developed a framework in ways of scaling up the use of indigenous knowledge. And if you see on the first phase, there is synthesis, where we have to identify the knowledge gap, because the idea of making suggestions in climate change adaptation is to encourage community members to adapt and also to implement the policy suggestions. So by this synthesis, there is need to identify the strength of indigenous knowledge and what is then needed. Then people must be then engaged in the indigenous people and co-develop an intervention together with the community members in adapting and adopting certain elements within the indigenous knowledge system that can be very useful in climate change adaptation. Also, then on its application, you don't really need to be advocating for policies or actions that then excludes the community members. We must co-implement things that work for our communities. We must then co-implement decisions that we think they are best for in water conservation and water governance in our communities. Then every action should then be sustained. Most of these strategies, the people have lost trust in these strategies, not because they don't work, but because we are not sustaining our strategies. They just work for a short period of time, then they are abandoned. So people end up believing that indigenous approaches are not working. Indigenous approaches do not work. But there is need to make sure that these actions and suggestions are sustained in our communities. Everyone involved, the community members should work together with all key stakeholders to make sure that the ideas and the approaches that are community-based are sustained. So what are we saying? We are saying that there is need for us to, find relevance in our approaches. Indigenous knowledge is relevant. Indigenous knowledge system has been used before. And we need then to believe in these strategies and support these strategies. But we are also aware that there are several challenges. For example, it's not documented, or we may need to document. We are also aware that there are several issues of modernity. People prefer to do things the modern way, but we also need to believe in the benefits in the long run of the indigenous knowledge systems we have. Then lastly, I just wanted to maybe reaffirm that indigenous knowledge system, indigenous knowledge is a significant resource that could be adopted and can also be used in climate mitigation and adaptation. Thus, we may, by adapting and adopting, we may need to integrate indigenous knowledge and also science-based knowledge, modern science, and find something that can work for our communities. But the one size fits all may not work. I've seen in some societies where these guidelines have not worked when they were implemented. I can just give you an example. For these exotic trees that have been, grown and they have invaded our communities. These, species destroying, I would say, our local species, the soil fertility, and also draining much needed water from the ground. So there is need to really find local-based solutions that can work for our communities. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Shadreck. That was a really informative presentation, and I think fit quite nicely in bringing more of a stronger focus on water management. I wonder if you can perhaps stop sharing so we can go into the discussion session. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so we've had some really interesting, very diverse and informative perspectives that have been shared. And thank you so much, Sinegugu, Claire, Shadreck. It's been really, you've all taken us through some really valuable information that I think really was just the tip of the iceberg. Ideally, we have in-person sessions in depth with each of you, but this format is what we have today. I think let's start with some of the questions that have been in the chat. I think there was a question around what are the main threats facing Indigenous food systems today, and I think maybe both, maybe first Sinegugu, you could respond to that, and then Claire, you could respond to that, and then Shadreck, if you feel like you also want to come in, you can. But yeah, we'll start with that question.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Tara. Yeah. The obvious ones in terms of indigenous knowledge is not put into the mainstream. We're happy, of course, with having people like Dr. Shadreck Muchaku here, because it is important for the indigenous knowledge systems to be mainstreamed. So we know academic institutions, they are beginning a process to consider them, but it is not yet given the equal footing. It is another way of knowing. So we need to make sure that it is mainstreamed as another form of knowledge. Even this question about indigenous knowledge versus science, there is a lot of science within the indigenous knowledge systems, but no one talks about the indigenous science. If, for instance, people were able to take a particular plant and study it, for instance, even knowing that that particular plant would be able to chase away a blind mole, there is something scientific. If how people have decided to make the traditional beer using maize or sorghum, there is science in it. So, but there is very little, it's not given the dignity and the respect that it deserves, and that has to change. And we, amongst other things, of course, there's a role for government, there's a role for academic institutions. But the other biggest threat is this so-called modernization or civilization and urbanization, of course. The more, because the schooling does not enforce the importance, it takes kids away from their indigenous knowledge system. So as a result, they do not learn to respect and to value that particular knowledge. So that needs to change. The same applies to even the food systems. So the food systems that provide us with really nutritious food are being ignored. It's only now that researchers, academics are beginning to come and they're digging that information. But again, it's not being. So people have thrown away a very valuable nutritious food in exchange for the rubbish food which we are buying from the grocery stores and all of that. So young people do not see the value of farming. As a result, that vocabulary of most of the things I mentioned here is disappearing because they do not see. Young people, when they go to school, university, they aspire to be wearing suits and being in fancy offices, and no one is talking about the value of that. And it is very important that we actually see the value of that, and we talk about it, we bring it forward to this discussion. But the biggest challenge in rural areas is the fact that the young people, they don't see the significance and the importance of that particular knowledge, and that could be turned around. It's not easy, because it's for a long time that knowledge has been undermined. So a lot needs to be done to try and raise the awareness. And we are doing the little that we could do, like we run food festivals where we talk about the indigenous food systems in our area, in order to encourage and to talk about the nutritional values of these indigenous dishes and the seed saving and all of those things. But a lot needs to be done. Thank you.
Thanks, Sinegugu. Claire, would you like to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Sinegugu. And maybe just to add some of the, I guess some of the big forces behind the neglect and destruction of indigenous food systems. So just to think maybe about the corporate control of the food system, the ability for large industrial food system players to influence policy to their benefit, so that the industrial food system really is over dominant and dwarfs so much of indigenous food production. And even if it doesn't, even if small scale and indigenous food production is actually very prominent, it gets so little attention because the industrial food system and its corporate kind of the corporations that are in charge of that just have a lot of power, both in industry and in government. And one of the aspects of that is that they are overrepresented in policy, but also that indigenous food is neglected in policy. So there's a lack of a clear policy pathway to recognize indigenous food. So it's kind of an overdominance of one and a neglect of the other that are kind of connected, but also separate issues. And then another issue is loss of land, and so loss of land by violent forced removals, which we all know have been happening for centuries across this region and across the world, but continue to happen because of mining projects and other large extractive projects, and that the loss of land leads to people not having agency over their land. It leads to destruction of ecosystems in which many indigenous foods exist already without even having to be cultivated. And that industrial agriculture is, again, one of those land uses that causes the loss of indigenous land and also damages that land, so through runoffs from pesticides and fertilizers. Yeah, perhaps those extra pieces. And maybe just one other thing to add is that some of the threats of mainstreaming indigenous food, so it's really important that it happens, like you say. But there also are some concerns that people expressed throughout the research. One being the co-option by the industrial food system. So sometimes you'll get like monoculture sorghum fields. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about an indigenous food system being restored rather than a single indigenous food being pulled into an industrial model. And then and another being the exposure to corporate interests. So where you might find a particular plant has great medicinal and nutritional value, and a corporation comes in and claims patents, steals that plant, and indigenous people do not have access to the use and the rights to that. So yeah, just some of those things that how does mainstreaming happen in a way that also protects indigenous access to indigenous foods?
Thanks so much, Claire. Shadreck, I don't know if you would like to also come in and add any potential additions to the question around what are the main challenges to indigenous food systems. I know that your presentation focused more on water, but there are also some other comments in the chat that I could maybe ask you to respond to. So you can maybe give a comment on the indigenous food systems question, but then also there are some specific questions around, for example, the practice of reusing water from washing, and maybe some thoughts on whether that could potentially be problematic given the chemicals of soap that might be within the water. Yeah, so maybe there's another question around drought, and I guess if you have anything maybe to add around indigenous water saving practices linking to drought, maybe you can also add on that as well. Sorry, those are 3 questions now. So if you want me to remind you, I can. You just need to unmute, sorry.
Oh, thank you. Like I said, I think the indigenous knowledge basically works better for a specific, it's context specific. So what may work for community A may not work for community B, but we happen to believe that indigenous knowledge is, in one way or the other, is also similar. What was practiced in A was also practiced in B in most cases. One of the biggest challenges to you said it's food, what?
Indigenous food systems.
Food systems. It's the issue for me is the issue of urbanization. Our youth, there is a knowledge gap between those with the wisdom, the community wisdom, and the young generation, because the young generation is not interested in the indigenous knowledge, not because maybe they just prefer modern science, but maybe also they have been a knowledge gap in the sense that knowledge has not been transferred from the older generation to the young generation. There is need then to bridge that gap. Youths are exposed to televisions. They are watching news and internet, and all that is stuffed there is modern science with very little on indigenous knowledge. So until we start documenting, we can go back to communities and raise awareness. But if we do that without also playing a part in documenting indigenous knowledge, without having movies that communicates indigenous knowledge to our local communities, songs that communicates that, our challenges will remain. So that's what I can say on the challenges part. But on the issue of water, I don't think it will work for us to have contaminated water, or they call it gray water for watering, because of the chemicals that are there. They sometimes even harden the soils and stuff. So it may not be advisable to use that water for agriculture. Unless there are other ways, maybe of, I don't know how, but for now, I have no idea of how we can use water that we have used for washing, for watering our gardens. In fact, what can then work is us to harvest the rainwater during the rain season. We harvest as much as we can. We have those side pits to make sure that whatever water that we have in our fields is also stored and preserved. We don't lose it, much of it through evaporation. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think also there's it can sometimes be dependent on what chemicals you are using in the soap. So I guess maybe there are possibilities where you're using less strong chemicals. But again, this is me just thinking out loud. Sinegugu, there's also a question in the chat. Bernadine was saying, in the Northern Cape, we experience wildtand mole, those with the long teeth. Can we use the same methods that were used, that you gave in your presentation for scaring away the blind mole? So I think Bernadine's referring to the bottles on the sticks dug into the field. So I think this was a specific question to you, Sinegugu.
I think what is important is to try it. It's such a simple invention, because you can actually, for better transfer of the sound underground, you put your stick through the blind mole mounds. You know, the blind mole, it would push the soil up. So you actually push your stick into those mounds, which is directly into the cavities or their pathways underground. So they can give it a try and actually see whether it works, because so the solution lies in the trial and error method. So that's what farmers have found to be effective. And I cannot guarantee that it is going to work in the other places. So they need to try it, because there is a whole lot of the other variables involved in terms of the sensitivity of that particular animal and what those animals they have gone through. There's a lot of mining in Northern Cape. We would never know what has happened. So, but they must try. It's a very, very simple innovation. Thank you.
So before you, I think Bernadette has just asked now, how long must the stick be? How deep must the stick be planted? And then it also has added, are we being speciesist in chasing away the moles?
I beg, excuse me, what's the second part of the question?
Are we being, oh yeah, Bernadette, you feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question directly.
I was just being silly about chasing away moles, and then we're being speciesist. As in, human beings are the primary whatever, our needs are more important than moles. But I was just being silly. I really wanted to know something practical. How long must the stick be? How deep into the mound or the ground must the stick be planted? Thank you so much.
So thank you. Usually the level at which the blind mole is not very deep. So it's a matter of making sure that the stick goes down to that tunnel which has been burrowed by the blind mole. Usually blind moles, they don't go very deep because they are looking for those crops. So in other words, when you push it down through that blind mole mound, the stick will hit the bottom. That's how far you go, and usually it's few centimeters. It can be anything between 5 to 20 centimeters down. So if you are targeting those places where there's already mound, so it is very simple, because when you push the stick, you don't have to use any tool like a hammer. You just push it down through those mounds, and it's easy to tell when you have reached the bottom of that. Thank you.
So there's one more question that I think is directed to you, about aloe vera for poultry, and whether it will help for fleas.
Okay, all right. No, definitely not for fleas. Okay, I think it will be interesting, those who have access to aloe vera, because aloe vera has got more amazing properties. We use aloe ferox. We have got aloe arborescens, and I think we've got an aloe maculata, but the best one is aloe ferox, which is what they call it in Zululand. They call it inhlaba, we call it in Bondoland, we call it umhlaba, and in the Xhosa land they call it ikhala. That's aloe ferox. That's the one, that's the bigger one, which makes those red candlesticks in June, July. So that one is kind of the best one. So what it does, it strengthens the immune system. That's what it does. Otherwise, for serious Newcastle fever or poultry diseases, we even go as far as garlic now. Otherwise, it just is for boosting the immune, to make sure that your chickens will be able to withstand when those fevers and flus come. Otherwise, when the thing's serious, the chicken starts being sick, you even use garlic. You can boil it, or you can crush it and put it into the water that your chickens drink. Yeah. So otherwise, it would not help with the fleas. With the fleas, we also use the kappa dust, as undesirable as it is. But again, you'd have to try the other things such as ash. But fleas in chickens tend to be a serious problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sine. I think there's a more broader question, or it's a comment in the chat, but I think maybe something that the three of you might want to respond to, just around David Munene has said in the chat that in his experience, there's been the unintentional and intentional holding back of Indigenous knowledge from elders, by elders from the young people, because of an assumption that young people are just disinterested, but actually that young people, when they do have access to the information, are really excited. And so maybe if you could comment on how do you are there any examples of or experiences that you've had of engaging young people around Indigenous knowledge that have been impactful in your sort of observation? And maybe we'll go Claire, Shadreck, and then Sinegugu.
Yes, thanks for that.
I'm not.
Sorry, Shadreck. We'll first go to Claire, and then we'll go to you. I'll repeat the question if you didn't get it, if that's okay. Okay, I think.
Yeah, so I had the honor of going to Amadiba in August last year, where young people organized an incredible Indigenous food festival, and it's not the first that they have done. And there's so much enthusiasm among this group of young people that I know Sinegugu works very closely with and is related to. And it's, yeah, there's so much excitement and so much, I could just really see so much connection across generations in during that festival, but also in the lead up to, and what should they make, and what what food should they make, and what seeds should be at the festival, and what cultural practices, and there was so much back and forth between young people and elders. And I wonder if maybe the urgency of climate change, as it kind of lands more and more among young people, and I think the recent kind of precedent-setting climate cases recently hopefully will start to build more of a youth movement around climate change, may lead young people to go to elders and say, we are facing these things that you may not live to see. What can you tell us? And that there's an urgency and there's an urgent project to collaborate on, where perhaps it may have been seen before as like, and something quaint from the old days, but now it's very urgent. And maybe if young people really internalize that, it will, initiate those conversations. My thoughts.
Thanks so much, Claire. Shadreck, do you want to come in now?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, a very good, insight. Surely sometimes it's unintentional, and I still think, with my experience as well in communities, the youths have not been given an adequate opportunity to interact with Indigenous knowledge. Most often, even in schools, because Indigenous knowledge has not been acknowledged, I would say, and is not being taught as much as there is emphasis on modern science. So that creates a presumption that the youths are disinterested. But if you give them platforms, if you engage them in communities, surely there is hunger to know more, and there is genuine interest to get to know some of to get to know Indigenous knowledge. We have been to schools targeting students who are around grade primary, I would say, under the mantra "Teach them young." So ideally, you'd find that when these young people are engaged and they are taught details about for example, the behavior of animals, how you can tell if it is going to rain by looking at the behavior of a duck, for example. If you see it spinning its wings, you know that it is going to rain. And surely that behavior, it works. It works so when they learn about this knowledge, they become so fascinated. And I just think what is lacking is an opportunity for young people to learn. That's what I can say. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Shadreck. Sine, I know you have probably a lot to say on this. Yeah, please come in.
Okay, yeah, there you are. Okay, yeah, there's a lot that can be said, but it depends. One, you need first a platform to discuss this. You create a platform. We have done it successfully in our community in Amatiba. You need to create a platform. One of the things we do is that if there are young people employed, maybe under EPWP, when we identify the types of training, whether it is a Yes for Youth, so we include the Indigenous knowledge system. We have trained young people on how to make films, and we use that skill for them to interview the elders to talk about Indigenous knowledge systems, talk about the Indigenous food. We've made films. There are films which are there on YouTube where we have actually tried to compare the Indigenous and the modern food that people eat and to get the elders to talk. When the elderly people are given the opportunity to talk about these things, you will always find those who are very passionate and who are able to share their knowledge freely. The challenge we have is that our way of life has changed so much that it doesn't give a platform and opportunity to elders to share the knowledge. When we were young, there was a lot of storytelling. There were no cell phones. There were very few radios. There were no TVs. Today, young people's time is taken by social networks in their smartphones. It's taken by television. Says there's so much that. So as a result, there isn't that time around the fireplace. You no longer have what we used to have 40, 50 years ago. So therefore, a platform needs to be created where the elders, schools need to put value on the Indigenous knowledge and invite elders to come and talk to those young people. So there's a whole lot. Opportunities are there, but it's a matter of creating a platform where those opportunities could be put into good use and to make sure the knowledge is shared and is packaged and framed and documented. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that and for these insights. I think I'm going to give some final wrap-up comments, and then we can end because we are a little bit over time. But I just want to summarize what the different inputs that have been said. I think what we're seeing is especially relevant for those who are rurally located and joining this webinar, that rural areas are huge resources of Indigenous knowledge that can be incredibly valuable in our approach to adapting to climate change impact, whether it's from the perspective of Indigenous foods and water management. I think something that's come up is how important trial and error and observation is in the science of practicing and learning from Indigenous knowledge. So that example, that back and forth between Sinegugu and one of the Bernadette around how deep does the stick go for chasing away the moles. It reiterates that Indigenous knowledge is a science form. It requires you to engage in learning through trial and error, through observation, but also something that I often say in these RACR webinars in reference to our rights within democratic South Africa, that if we don't use our rights, we lose them. And I think that holds the same for Indigenous knowledge, which is that many of you come from areas that are rich in Indigenous knowledge, but if that Indigenous knowledge is not used, we really risk losing it as an older generation moves on holding that knowledge. So I hope that through this conversation, you're thinking about how you can draw Indigenous knowledge holders. And I know that many of you already are doing this in different ways, but I hope that it reiterates the importance of bringing Indigenous knowledge holders into the work that you're doing. And then another point that came up is around the importance of lowering our reliance on industrial food systems and how that can be an element or approach to responding to the climate shocks that might disrupt our food systems. So diversifying our food sources, localizing our food sources, and again, drawing on Indigenous knowledge that already exists around how we can do so at a local level. And then again, around water management and water management techniques. And then finally, the role of bringing in youth and having this intergenerational conversation active and alive. Someone mentioned African Climate Alliance in the chat. African Climate Alliance is Cape Town based, but they do work throughout the continent. I think for many of you being more rurally located, it's also important that the roles that you play within your communities as these kind of beacons of conversation around climate change and bringing that climate change conversation into rural parts of South Africa. So again, I hope that this has been a useful webinar. I hope that you also don't see it as us telling you what Indigenous knowledge is, because many of you are coming from areas and experience that is firsthand in terms of the wealth of knowledge that is present within your areas. But I hope that having these conversations and a webinar like this reiterates the importance of Indigenous knowledge. And again, the comment that Claire made about how within our agricultural systems we have Indigenous food neglected and industrial agriculture being overemphasized. I hope like webinars and conversations like this can work to shift the conversation and the balance a little bit more in favor of prioritizing the importance and the value of Indigenous knowledge and including that in our climate change responses. Just in terms of communication going forward, I know there were some conversations around the chat around how we get access to the webinars and the resources shared. The webinars are recorded and they will be posted online on our YouTube channel. Usually we share the webinar presentations within the RACR project participants, but those of you who are not within the project will contact you and see if we can also share those with you directly. We do invite people, we post about these webinars online, so and in different groups. So in future, we'll also make an effort to directly invite ACA as well. Okay, so before we all head off, just a request for all of us to turn on our cameras so we can take a picture and just see everybody's faces. We like to do that at the end, just to thank our speakers and acknowledge them, and also just say hello to everyone in the call.
Tara, forgive me, this is Bernadette Muthin. I see Anna Marie Hendricks here. It's so wonderful to see her. She's a veteran of intersectional struggles. I just wanted to acknowledge her. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernadette. Okay, so there are
quite a few people haven't put their cameras on yet. We have 3 pages worth of people, and so far only page 1 has pictures. So if it is voluntary, we can't switch your camera from our side. So if you don't want to, that's okay. But if you don't switch your camera on, it will just say your name. So there's that. Okay, so will you do it, Tara, or shall I?
I think
I'm on it.
I can. Oh, you're on it. Thanks,
Yeah.
Mati.
Okay.
Thanks, Sinegugu. I see you have to leave, but thank you so much for your time and insights and sharing. Okay. Don't know if you want to tell us, Mati, if you
Yeah, I
which
think
page
I have
you
pinned in
done.
all the pages. Yeah. Unfortunately, quite a lot of people don't have their cameras on, but for those that do, thank you.
Okay.
We're good.
I'm just gonna also.
Thank you.
I'm gonna do just in case backup. Okay. Sorry, I'm just on the last one.
Everyone's smiling so nicely. Okay. And then just some housekeeping for RACR participants. We're gonna have another webinar next month. We'll send out a survey and because many, as I said, many of you have your own experience around Indigenous knowledge and the projects that you've been doing. So we want to give you an opportunity to also share within the RACR project and with a broader audience as well, the project and the projects and work that you've been doing within your different community organizations and faith groups. So we'll send out a survey in the WhatsApp group. And you can fill in the survey if you would like to be part of that webinar. And so you'll be hearing from me and Claire in the WhatsApp group again shortly. And we hope that this has been a useful webinar for you. It was again informed by your input on our many Google Forms that we send you that you probably are very sick of at this stage. But yeah, great to see all of you online. Hope that you are all keeping well. And I forgot to say Happy New Year, even though I did say it in the WhatsApp group. But yeah, we hope that you're all keeping well and sending our thoughts to all of you across the country. Yeah. So thanks everyone and see you online and on the WhatsApp group. Bye.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Bye.
yeah, thanks. And Shadreck and Claire, thank you so much. Oh, I think Claire's just left. But yeah, thank you so much again for your time. It was really appreciated and very informative.
Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity, Tim. It has been a pleasure working with you guys, and I hope to learn and contribute more in future.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Happy New Year. Welcome to the season.